The neighborhood always looked peaceful from the outside, but there was always something tense in the air, especially around the homes that sat inside the community association area. People often whispered about how strict the board was, how they watched every little thing, and how they liked to remind everyone that they were in charge. But the person living just outside the boundary never worried too much about them. Life was simple, quiet, and steady. The land stretched wide and open, and the small house sat in the middle of it, like it had always belonged there. Most days began the same way. A soft breeze came from the trees, birds moved around the grass, and the landowner spent the early hours walking around the property, checking things, fixing small repairs, and enjoying the peace that came with owning land that had been in the family for years. Nothing dramatic ever happened there, and that was the beauty of it. But one day, an envelope showed up in the mailbox. It looked formal, with the Community Association logo printed neatly at the top. At first, it seemed odd. The landowner didn't live under the association's rules. The house wasn't part of their community. The land wasn't inside their boundaries. There had never been a reason for them to send anything. The letter said the association believed a section of the land actually belonged to them, and that the landowner needed to remove certain items that were violating community guidelines. For a long moment, the landowner just stared at the page, reading it over twice, then 3 times, trying to understand where this sudden claim had come from. It felt like a mistake, something that would go away with a simple conversation. But life rarely stayed simple at first. The landowner tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they truly misunderstood the property lines. It wasn't unusual. Lines on maps could be confusing. But deep down, something felt off. The tone of the letter wasn't friendly or curious. It wasn't written like someone asking a question. It felt like a warning. The next day, another letter came. This one sounded harsher. It demanded immediate action. It said the landowner must follow the rules or face further consequences. There was no greeting, just instructions. It felt strange, almost unreal, like these people had already decided they were right. Even though they had never asked a single question, the landowner didn't react with anger. Instead, they took a slow walk to the edge of the property, where the land supposedly overlapped with the association's area. Everything looked normal. The markers placed years ago were still in the ground. The records in the old file cabinet inside the house were clear. The land had been measured, surveyed, confirmed, and signed for. Nothing about the property lines had changed. Still, something inside said this was only the beginning, and that feeling proved right when 2 members of the association showed up unannounced. They came walking across the field as if the place already belonged to them. They didn't knock. They didn't wait at the gate. They simply stepped onto the land like they owned it. And the expression on their faces showed a kind of confidence that didn't match the situation. One of them began talking immediately, barely taking a breath. They said the association had reviewed their maps again and believed the landowner's fence was sitting on community property. They said the association had plans for that area, and it needed to be cleared soon. The other person stood there nodding, crossing their arms, acting like this wasn't a conversation, but an order. The landowner listened quietly, never interrupting, never raising a voice. The words didn't make sense. None of it matched the real records, the maps, or the long history of the land. When the association members finished speaking, the landowner gently explained that the land truly wasn't theirs, that everything had been recorded long before the association was even formed, and that nothing had changed since. It was a calm explanation, simple and honest. But the visitors didn't accept it. They repeated their claims again, this time sounding more irritated. They insisted their information was correct. They mentioned rules and guidelines, even though those rules didn't apply. They talked like people who were used to winning every argument, like people who had never been challenged. When they finally left, they walked away with a smug confidence, as if they believed the landowner would eventually give in. But nothing inside the landowner felt shaken. If anything, the interaction made things much clearer. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else, something intentional. The next week brought even more trouble. The association sent a notice saying they would begin an inspection of the land. There was no request for permission. They wrote it like a schedule, not a question. And that was when the landowner realized the association wasn't just trying to claim the land. They were preparing to act like they already owned it. True enough. 2 days later, a group of association board members entered the property again. Walking around, pointing at things, taking pictures, and placing small flags in the ground. One of them even carried a clipboard, checking off boxes as if this were an official job. Most people would have yelled or confronted them. But the landowner stayed steady, thinking ahead, documenting everything quietly. Not out of fear, but out of experience. When people acted this confident without proof, the truth usually caught up eventually. It always did. Still, watching them walk around the land felt strange. It felt like watching strangers walk through a part of your story without permission, acting like the pages belonged to them. They had no idea what the land meant, how long it had been cared for, or how deeply connected it was to the person living there. They didn't see any of that. They only saw something they believed they could take, and they weren't done. Soon, a fence appeared along a small section of the property line. Not a big fence, just a temporary one, but it was enough to send a clear message. They put it up quickly, quietly, like they didn't want anyone to notice, until it was done. It stood there like a claim, a line drawn by people who didn't respect boundaries, literally or otherwise. Neighbors walked by with confused looks. Some whispered to each other. Some avoided eye contact, not wanting to be involved. Everyone knew how strict the association could be. Many had seen how they handled disagreements inside their community. The board had a reputation for pushing people around until they got what they wanted. But this time, they weren't dealing with someone who panicked easily. They weren't dealing with someone who could be pressured into giving up. And most importantly, they weren't dealing with someone who lacked resources. The landowner stood there one evening, looking at the fence, feeling neither fear nor anger, just a deep sense of clarity. If the association wanted a fight, they would eventually discover they had chosen the wrong opponent. Not because of arguments or loud confrontations, but because they truly didn't understand the situation they had stepped into. The land looked simple from the outside, just open fields, trees, and a quiet house. But beneath the ground was something the association didn't know about, something they had never bothered to research. And that single piece of information would change everything for now. The landowner let them continue with their assumptions. Sometimes letting people reveal their true intentions was the smartest thing to do. And the association was revealing plenty. They sent more letters, more warnings, more demands, each one bolder than the last. They acted as if they were the rightful owners, and the landowner was just someone in their way. They spoke with entitlement, with certainty, with ego. But behind every letter, behind every threat, behind every unannounced visit, there was something they didn't know. Something that would soon make them regret. Every action they had taken, because the land they were trying to claim was not just land, it was their lifeline, something they depended on every single day without realizing it. The landowner looked over the field again, a soft breeze passing by, and felt a quiet confidence forming inside. They didn't need to yell. They didn't need to threaten. All they needed was the truth. And when the time came to show it, the association's entire plan would fall apart in a single moment. That moment was coming soon, but for now, the landowner waited, watched, and let the association dig themselves deeper into a problem they had created with their own arrogance, completely unaware that they were attacking the very person who supplied the most important thing their homes needed too: function water. And once that truth came out, nothing would ever be the same again. The trouble did not slow down after the fence went up. If anything, the association seemed to grow more confident, as if putting a few temporary posts in the ground had somehow given them ownership of the place, and the landowner could see it in their behavior. Little things started happening every day, things small enough to seem harmless, but persistent enough to show clear intent. Some mornings, new flags appeared in the soil, bright and sharp, placed in a straight line as if someone had marched through the field before sunrise. Other days, small orange markers hung on branches, swaying in the wind. That's like silent reminders that someone had walked the land without permission again. And some afternoons, the landowner spotted people from the association standing at the edge of the property, pointing, squinting, arguing among themselves, then leaving without a word. It was strange to watch. These were grown adults acting like they were staking a claim on a place they barely understood. But the landowner kept calm, not because the situation was easy, but because reacting emotionally would only feed their confidence. Sometimes the strongest move was patience. Still, the association clearly expected the landowner to fight with stress, to panic, or to fold under pressure. But none of those things happened. Instead, every day the landowner took slow walks across the field, checked the markers, took pictures, saved everything, and stayed quiet. Quiet didn't mean weak. Quiet often meant prepared. One afternoon, while the landowner was clearing fallen branches near the tree line, the sound of footsteps approached. It was another group of association board members, 3 this time. They didn't greet. They didn't smile. They came with clipboards and papers like they were attending some formal inspection. The first person in the group spoke quickly, saying they were there to evaluate the encroachment. The second person pointed at the fence as if it were evidence. The third flipped through papers like they were reading out rules. The landowner listened again. No interruptions. No raised voice. Just a steady gaze. When they finished, the landowner simply asked, "Did you check the county survey maps?" Their reaction said everything. They froze. They hadn't. They had walked through the land, placed flags, built a fence, taken pictures, sent threats, and even planned an inspection, but had never checked the actual survey. They had only looked at rough online maps, the kind that often misplaced borders by several feet. But instead of admitting it, they doubled down. One of them waved a paper in the air and said they knew what they were doing. Another person said the association had the authority. The third said the landowner would benefit from cooperating. Benefit. That word hung in the air like a stale smell. Benefit for whom? Certainly not for the landowner. It was clear the association thought they could bully their way into ownership of the area. They had no idea they were trespassing on land that played a far more important role than they understood when they eventually left. The landowner returned to work, feeling a strange mix of amusement and anticipation. They were pushing harder. But without knowing the foundation they stood on was made of sand. A few days later, a new letter arrived. This one was several pages long and filled with bold text, capital letters, and underlined sentences. It said the association would start a beautification project on the disputed area within the next month. It said the landowner must cooperate or step aside. It said the association would move forward with improvements, regardless of resistance. It almost sounded like they were preparing for a small takeover. The landowner read the letter slowly. Sitting by the kitchen window, where sunlight fell across the table, the words were aggressive, but they didn't stir anger. If anything, they made things clearer. The association wasn't just confused, they were confident. Too confident. And confidence without information often led people straight into trouble. The landowner folded the letter neatly, placed it with the others, continued the evening as if nothing unusual had happened. But things outside the house were changing. Neighbors began noticing the association's behavior. Some whispered about the strange flags and fences. Some complained they were tired of the board's strict rules inside the community. Some simply watched quietly from their porches, wondering why the association was suddenly obsessed with land that wasn't theirs. One evening, as the sun started dipping behind the trees, an elderly neighbor walked over. He stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the fence the association had put up. After a long silence, he softly said, "They're doing too much." The landowner nodded. The neighbor looked uneasy. "They've been talking like they already own this place. They're telling people it's part of a future project. But this land isn't theirs." "I know," the landowner said gently. The neighbor hesitated before adding, "Just be careful. They don't stop once they start something. They like to win." The landowner smiled peacefully, not with arrogance, but with understanding. "They don't know the whole story. The neighbor raised his brows, curious, but didn't ask questions. Instead, he nodded respectfully and walked back home. That night, the landowner sat outside, letting the cool air pass across the open field. The stars blinked quietly in the sky, and everything looked so peaceful that it was almost impossible to believe the land had become a battlefield for control. The landowner thought back to the early years, to the time when the well system had been built. It was a small project then, just something meant to keep water flowing to the property and a few nearby homes. But when the community grew, many houses had been connected to that same well long before the association even existed. It wasn't something secret. It was simply something the board never bothered to learn. They had moved into leadership positions without understanding the infrastructure beneath their own community. They enforced rules without knowing the history of the land around them. And now, their ignorance was steering them into a situation they weren't prepared for. A few days later, the association escalated things again. This time, early in the morning, workers arrived with measuring tools and equipment. They paced around the property line, squinting at papers, pacing back and forth, muttering about future plans. The landowner stepped outside, watching them calmly. The workers didn't look aggressive, they looked confused. One of them eventually walked up and explained that they were hired by the association to take measurements for a planned garden area. The landowner nodded and asked one simple question. "Did they show you the ownership documents?" The worker blinked. Documents. They just said this was their project area. The landowner pointed at the ground. "This is private land, not theirs." The worker frowned, confused and uncomfortable. He checked his map again. "That's not what they told us. Didn't tell you the whole story," the landowner said softly. And just like that, the workers packed their tools and left. They didn't want to get involved in a dispute they weren't responsible for. They didn't want legal problems. They just wanted clarity, and they weren't getting any from the association. When the association found out the workers had left without taking any measurements, another aggressive letter arrived. They accused the landowner of obstruction. They accused them of interfering with community development, even threatened legal action. Though it was empty talk, but something else happened too. People in the community began talking. They had seen the workers leaving. They had noticed the association members arguing among themselves. They had seen the landowner remain calm despite everything. Whispers slowly turned into curiosity, and curiosity turned into confusion about why the association was even doing this. One afternoon, while the landowner was tending to plants near the old shed, two more neighbors approached. They didn't look aggressive. They looked worried. They asked gently if the association had the right to do what they were doing. They asked if the land truly belonged to the landowner. They asked if everything was okay. The landowner reassured them with a calm smile, but inside, quiet understanding grew stronger. The association was building pressure on themselves. They were pushing harder without checking facts. They were acting with force instead of logic. And they were burying themselves deeper into a conflict they didn't have the tools to win. One evening, the sunlight softened and the sky turned gold. A group of board members returned. This time they carried rolled-up blueprints, claiming they had official maps, showing the disputed area inside their boundary. The landowner watched them unroll the maps across the hood of a car. They pointed at lines with confidence lines drawn from outdated online sources. The landowner didn't argue. Instead, they quietly walked back inside, brought out the actual certified survey documents, and placed them gently beside the association's papers. The difference was obvious. 1. Map was generic. The other map was legally stamped and signed by the county. For a moment, the board members went silent. Their faces tightened. Their eyes moved quickly between the papers, trying to find a way to justify their actions, but instead of accepting the truth, they brushed it off. One of them said, "We'll have our own survey done." Another said, "We don't trust old paperwork." The third said, "This doesn't change our project." And once again, they walked away. But this time, something had changed. Their confidence had cracks. Their voices weren't as strong. Their steps weren't as steady, and the landowner noticed every detail. The association still didn't understand what they were dealing with. They didn't know who they were pushing. They didn't know the land they wanted wasn't just a piece of ground. They didn't know how much depended on it, but they were about to find out, because the more they pushed, the closer they came to discovering the truth that would turn all their plans upside down. And the landowner, calm as ever, simply waited for the moment they would finally realize the mistake they had been making from the very beginning. The days that followed felt unusually calm. Almost a calm, like the quiet before a storm. The association had gone silent for a short while. No new letters. No surprise visits. No flags placed in the ground. But anyone who had lived near them long enough knew their silence didn't mean surrender. It meant planning. The landowner used the quiet time to take care of regular tasks, checking the well system, trimming branches, clearing pathways, and making sure everything around the property was running smoothly. The work wasn't difficult, but it was steady, the kind of work that made a person feel grounded. And grounding was important, especially when trouble was brewing nearby. One evening, as the landowner was inspecting the well shed, a memory surfaced. It wasn't something dramatic, just a simple moment from years ago, when a handful of neighbors had approached asking if they could connect to the well. Their homes had been built before the town installed proper water lines, and back then, the community was small. People helped each other, shared resources, and supported one another without thinking twice. The landowner remembered the handshake agreements, the friendly conversations, the shared understanding that water was a basic need, and helping others was simply the right thing to do. There had been no association then. There had been no rules, no fines, no threats, just neighbors trying to build their lives. Those early agreements were later written into formal documents when the county updated its records, and everything was made legal and clear. The well remained private property. The supply remained under the control of the landowner, and only a handful of houses still relied on it, but those houses were inside the association's territory. That connection mattered. If the well shut down, those homes would lose water almost instantly, and not just for drinking. No water for showers, cooking, cleaning, or emergencies. The association didn't know this. They had grown so focused on rules and power that they never learned the history of the land they claimed to represent. Sometimes the landowner wondered how the association would react when they found out. Panic? Rage? Embarrassment? No one could predict it, but the truth always showed itself when the time was right. The quiet stretched for nearly a week before the next move came. On a warm morning, a white SUV rolled up to the edge of the property. 3 people stepped out, different board members this time. They had folders tucked under their arms. Their faces carried a serious expression, like people preparing for a courtroom argument. They didn't walk onto the property immediately. Instead, they stood at the edge, whispering among themselves, pointing at the temporary fence the association had installed, then at the open field. Their conversation looked tense. One of them seemed frustrated, shaking their head over and over. Finally, they walked toward the house. The landowner stepped outside, calm as always. One of them held up a stack of papers. "We had our preliminary review done," the person said, speaking with an air of importance. "We believe the boundary issue may be more complicated than we thought." That was the first hint of hesitation the board had shown since the conflict began. The landowner nodded gently. "Did you check the official county records?" "We checked some documents," another board member replied quickly, avoiding eye contact. "But there are inconsistencies." That word held a mix of hope and panic. Hope that they still had a chance to claim the land, and panic that they might be wrong. The landowner waited quietly. "We want to schedule a full survey," the first person continued. "A professional one. The association will handle it." The landowner didn't object. Instead, they simply said, "Make sure your surveyor contacts the county first. The records are already clear." That comment tightened their expressions. They didn't want to be reminded that someone else might have more accurate information than they did. After a short exchange, the board members left, their faces mixed with frustration and forced politeness. But things didn't end there. 2 days later, just after sunrise, a survey truck pulled up. Not the one hired by the landowner years ago, but a new one, sent by the association. The workers looked professional, tired, and not particularly interested in the politics of the situation. They carried tools and equipment, ready to do their job. The landowner greeted them kindly, not standing in their way. They appreciated that these workers were just doing their job, not trying to pick sides. One of the surveyors asked to walk the property. The landowner agreed, as long as they followed the law and respected boundaries. For hours, the surveyors measured distances, checked earlier markers, compared maps, and took readings. They talked quietly among themselves. Once in a while, one of them would look confused, shake their head, and start measuring again. By the end of the day, the lead surveyor approached the landowner. "We're done," he said with a simple nod. "Find what you needed." The landowner asked calmly. The surveyor hesitated. "Let's just say things don't match the association's claim. Not even close." He sighed, tired and honest. "We'll file our report with them. It's not our place to get involved, but the land is yours." Clearly. The landowner thanked him kindly. The survey team left soon after. The next morning, the explosion happened, not a literal one, but a storm of anger. 3 angry board members marched up to the property line, waving papers in their hands. Their voices were raised before they even reached the house. "This survey is wrong." One of them shouted, "This doesn't make sense." Another yelled, "It contradicts everything we were told." The landowner opened the door, calm as a still lake. "Is something wrong?" The board members thrust papers forward. The survey results were printed clearly, bold lines showing the property boundary far outside the association's claims. "This can't be accurate." One board member barked. "It's accurate," the landowner said gently. They weren't trying to brag, just stating a fact. The board members argued for several minutes, voices rising, hands waving in frustration. They took turns pointing at the land, at the fence, at the survey results, hoping their volume would change the truth. But truth didn't bend. At some point, their shouting quieted. They realized nothing they said could alter the written facts. And that's when a new expression appeared on their faces. Fear. Not fear of losing land. Fear of being wrong. Fear of looking weak in front of the community. Fear of losing control. They left shortly afterward, their behavior tense and shaky. And then, something unexpected happened. People inside the community started approaching the landowner to complain or take sides, but to ask questions. Did the association really get it wrong? Are they going to stop bothering you? Why were they so angry? And most importantly, why are they trying so hard to take your land? The landowner didn't offer dramatic explanations. They didn't blame anyone. They simply said the situation was being handled. But curiosity kept growing. Whispers spread. Small groups started forming, the association board. Once feared for their strict rules, felt the pressure building. They had been wrong about the survey. They had pushed too hard, too fast, without checking the facts. And now their own community was questioning their decisions. Still, the board wasn't finished. Their desperation grew. A week later, a notice appeared in the landowner's mailbox. It said the association intended to hold a formal hearing about the land dispute. They wanted to bring everything to an official meeting, including community members. It sounded serious, but it also sounded like they were trying to regain control of a situation slipping out of their hands. The landowner didn't panic. Instead, they gathered the documents, the old contracts, the water agreements, the original surveys, the updated surveys, and the formal county records. All of it was neatly organized in a simple folder. The hearing was set for the weekend. When the day arrived, the landowner walked into the community hall, a quiet place with rows of chairs and a long table where the association board sat. Dozens of residents filled the room. Some looked curious. Some looked nervous. Some looked irritated. The board tried to begin with confidence, but their voices wobbled. They presented their claims, their maps, their concerns. Then it was the landowner's turn. They spoke calmly, explaining the true history of the land. They showed the legally stamped documents. They showed the survey results. They showed the water agreement. The room fell silent, and then the realization spread across the board members' faces. They weren't just wrong. They were dependent. Dependent on the well, dependent on the land, dependent on the very person they had been threatening. The silence grew heavier. One resident whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Wait. So if that land wasn't theirs, and the well is on it, then who controls the water? All eyes slowly turned toward the landowner. No words were needed. The truth filled the room. It's like a cold wind. For the first time since the conflict began, the association looked scared, and they should have been, because the landowner held more power than they had ever imagined, and the association's actions had led them straight toward a truth they never prepared for. The truth that the person they had been trying to intimidate was the same person keeping their water flowing every day. And now, everything was about to change. The sun was just beginning to rise when he stepped outside. Hoping the fresh air would help him calm the storm building in his chest, the past few days had been heavy, and the meeting with the HOA only made things worse. He had walked in hoping for honesty and understanding, but instead he was met with cold faces and people pretending they had never seen the documents he had shown before. It felt like a game to them, and he hated games, especially the kind where people pretended to hold power they didn't actually have. He stood near the small hill that overlooked the land he had worked on for years. Every tree, every pipe, every piece of fencing, everything in that area had been touched by his own hands. When he first bought the place, it was wild and uneven, but he turned it into something peaceful. People didn't see the effort, the time. Sweat HOA members only cared about what they wanted, not how things came to be. As he stood there thinking, he heard the gravel crunch behind him. It was his neighbor, an older man who had always treated him kindly. The neighbor walked over slowly, his hands in his pockets and eyes full of concern. He asked if everything was all right because he had seen the HOA members leaving the area earlier with sour looks on their faces. He nodded a little, not wanting to worry him, but the neighbor could tell something was off. So he explained. Not the full story, but enough for the old man to shake his head in frustration. The neighbor said he had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had seen the HOA try similar tricks before, though never this bold. He warned that the people running the board now were hungry for control and believed they could bend anyone to their will. Hearing this only strengthened his resolve. He was not someone who backed down easily. The neighbor offered to help, even saying he could bring in a couple of old friends who understood land disputes and paperwork, but he declined politely. He didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess, and he felt he needed to handle things on his own terms. His neighbor nodded, respecting his decision, though his worry remained clear. Later that day, he drove into town to check on some supplies. While at the store, he overheard two HOA members talking near the gardening aisle. They didn't notice him at first, so he stood quietly near a shelf of tools, listening. They were discussing how they planned to gather signatures from residents, claiming that the land in question was part of the community's shared space. One of them even joked that people usually signed anything as long as it looked official. Hearing them laugh about it made his jaw tighten. It wasn't the paperwork that bothered him, but the attitude behind it. They didn't care about truth. They cared about winning. He took a breath and stepped out from behind the shelf. When they saw him, they froze. Their eyes widened, and the laughter died instantly. They looked like children caught doing something they knew they shouldn't. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten them, didn't show anger. Instead, he simply asked if this was really the path they wanted to take. The tone of his voice made them shift uncomfortably. They tried to act casual, pretending the conversation was harmless, but he knew exactly what they were trying to do. Before he left, he reminded them that lying on community documents could cause serious trouble for everyone involved. They forced smiles, but their eyes told the truth. They were nervous. Driving back home, he began planning his next step. He knew that words alone weren't enough. The HOA board was stubborn, and they believed they could push him until he gave up. But they had no idea he had something they didn't: control over the water system that supplied their entire neighborhood. The pipeline ran under his land, and he was the one who had allowed them connections years ago. Long before the HOA existed, he never used that fact as leverage. It wasn't his style. But now things were different. He wasn't planning anything harsh or unfair, but he needed them to understand that respect worked both ways. If they continued pushing, he would have no choice but to protect what was his. That evening, while checking the perimeter of his land, he saw a few HOA members standing near the fence again. They were pointing at the ground, whispering to each other, holding some documents. He approached calmly, but the moment they saw him, they stepped back like they had been caught again. One of them held a measuring tape, another had a clipboard, and a third was nervously avoiding eye contact. He asked what they were doing, and they said they were reassessing boundary lines. He told them, as politely as he could, that no one was allowed to do that on his property without proper authorization. They muttered something about community rights, but he didn't let it pass. He reminded them that the land had been surveyed more than once with official records filed. The only reason they were still trying was because they were hoping he wouldn't notice. The tension grew so thick that one of them finally folded the measuring tape and suggested they leave for now. When they were gone, he stood alone by the fence for a long moment. The situation was getting worse, and he knew it. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about control. The HOA board didn't like being told no, and they were used to residents giving in. They simply didn't know who they were dealing with. As night fell, he went inside and sat at his desk. He pulled out the old folder containing documents, maps, and letters from years ago. All the proof he needed was right there. But as he flipped through the pages, another thought crossed his mind. Instead of waiting for the HOA to strike again, maybe it was time he made the first move. He drafted a simple letter, aggressive, not threatening, just clear. It explained the history of his land, the legal boundaries, and the water system that ran through it. It reminded the HOA that cooperation had always been something he believed in, but cooperation required honesty on both sides. The letter was firm but fair. Before sealing the envelope, he paused, wondering how they would react. The board members were proud people. They didn't like being told they were wrong, but they needed to understand the truth before things spiraled any further. The next morning, he delivered the letter to the HOA office himself. The receptionist, who always stayed neutral, looked at the envelope nervously, but accepted it politely. He left without saying much, choosing to let the words speak for themselves. For the rest of the day, stayed busy with his tasks, though his mind kept drifting back to the letter. He didn't know whether it would calm the situation or light a fire under them, but at least he had taken a step forward in the evening. As he walked around to check the water lines, he noticed something unusual. Footprints in the soil near one of the access points. Fresh ones. Someone had been snooping around the exact area where the main valve was. He crouched down, studying the prints. 2 sets. One heavier, one lighter. Someone had been there recently, maybe, within the last few hours. The realization sent a wave of irritation through him. He wasn't angry yet, but he was getting there. Whoever it was, they were looking for something, or trying to figure out something. And the only reason they would be looking near the water valve was if they were starting to understand just how important his land truly was. He stood slowly, the quiet evening air growing colder around him. The HOA board thought they were prepared for a fight about land. They had no idea a much bigger truth was waiting for them, and soon. They would learn exactly what kind of mistake they had made. The morning started quietly, but there was a tension in the air that he could feel even before he stepped outside. It was the kind of silence that carried a warning, almost like the world was holding its breath. He walked to the porch with a cup of warm tea in his hand and looked across the land that had become the center of the conflict. He didn't want trouble, never had. But trouble had come anyway, and now it was reaching its peak. He took a slow sip, letting the heat calm him, even though his mind was anything but calm. The footprints he discovered near the water valve the previous evening kept circling in his thoughts. He had spent years maintaining that system, making sure the flow stayed steady, clean, and reliable. And now someone was treating it like a puzzle they wanted to solve without asking him a single question. Before he could think further, he saw a car slowing down near his driveway, then another, and another. 3 cars total. He felt his shoulders stiffen. It didn't take a genius to guess who it was. The HOA board had arrived, and judging by the number of people stepping out, they weren't here for a friendly chat. 5 members walked toward him. Their eyes were cold, their expressions sharp. They looked like they had practiced this moment in their heads, expecting him to panic or fold. But he didn't. He simply waited. The board president, a man who always acted like he was the smartest in the room, stepped forward with a folder in hand. Without even greeting him, he opened the folder and began talking. He said the board had reviewed the land and believed the section near the back belonged to the community. He said they were preparing to install a new walking path, benches, and even a seating area for neighborhood gatherings. He spoke like everything was already decided, but he didn't react. He just kept listening. Then the president added something important. He said they would begin marking the area later that week and expected him to move any equipment or fencing that might get in the way. That was when he finally raised his eyes to meet theirs. He asked them one simple question. "Did you read the letter?" The board members glanced at each other. A few shifted uncomfortably. The president hesitated, then said yes. They read it, but they didn't consider it relevant. He said the water system wasn't the HOA's concern and had nothing to do with the land issue. He said that if he continued making things difficult, they would call for a community vote to override him. He took a slow breath. They still didn't understand. So he asked if they would like to see something before they made final decisions. The president frowned, but agreed, mostly out of confidence that nothing he said would change their stance. He led them across the field. Passing trees and old pipes hidden under patches of soil, the board members whispered among themselves, some complaining about the walk, others grumbling about the early morning. After a few minutes, they reached the small structure near the back, a simple wooden shed with a locked door. For years, that shed quietly protected the heart of the system that kept the community's water flowing. He took out a key and opened the door. Inside was the main control panel, the pumps, the gauges, and the system logs he had maintained for more than a decade. The board members stared at it, confused. None of them seemed to understand what they were looking at, so he explained, calmly, patiently. He showed them the original agreements from when he first allowed the lines to run across his land. He showed them the permits, the maintenance logs, and the supply records. He explained how water from his underground source fed into the system that the entire neighborhood relied on. And then he showed them something that made their faces pale. A clause, a simple line in the old agreement stating that if the HOA or any future governing body attempted to claim or modify any part of his land without his written permission, he had the right to disconnect the system until the issue was resolved. The shed fell silent. One of the board members swallowed hard. Another looked at the ground, stunned. The president blinked slowly, his confidence cracking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten them. He didn't have to. The truth was right there. Written in clear words they could not argue against, he explained that he had never once considered using that power. He had always believed in helping the community. He had repaired leaks on weekends, cleared debris during storms, and made sure no home ever ran out of water. He had done all of it without asking for credit or payment, but now they were trying to take his land. The president tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He said they didn't know. He said the documents weren't in the board records. He tried to shift blame. But shifting blame didn't change the situation. He told them that all he wanted was respect. If they had questions, they could have come to him. If they had concerns, they could have talked to him. Instead, they tried to go behind his back, sneaking around his land, claiming pieces that didn't belong to them. One of the board members finally broke down and apologized. Sincerely, she said she had no idea the system existed, let alone that it supplied everyone. She admitted they should have handled the situation differently. The president looked defeated. His bold attitude was gone. He asked what the board needed to do to fix things. He took a moment before answering. He said they needed to withdraw all claims immediately, fix their records, stop the signatures they were trying to collect, and most importantly, treat his property with the respect it deserved. The board agreed quickly, too quickly, but he didn't mind. This was the first good decision they had made in a long time, as they walked back toward the cars. The president stayed behind for a moment. He seemed embarrassed, maybe even a bit humbled. He finally admitted something that surprised him. He said he had always assumed the land at the back was unused and empty. He didn't think it mattered to anyone. He responded gently. He said everything mattered to someone. That was the problem, not understanding what others valued. The president nodded quietly, then thanked him before walking away. For the first time in weeks, the land felt peaceful again. The board sent an official letter 2 days later, formally withdrawing all claims. They even rewrote the boundary documents to make sure the mistake would never happen again. The president stepped down shortly after, and the board brought in new members who actually cared about fairness. A few neighbors even came to thank him when they learned the truth, that he had been quietly providing water to everyone for years. Many had assumed the system was part of the city network. They were grateful, surprised, and some even offered to help with maintenance in the future. He didn't ask for anything in return. Their respect was enough. One afternoon, as he checked the water lines, he noticed something simple but meaningful, a small hand-painted sign near the neighborhood entrance. It read, "Thank you for keeping our homes running." He stood there for a long moment, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt since the whole conflict began. Not the warmth of victory, but the warmth of understanding. The HOA had tried to take something from him. They had underestimated him. They had pushed him too far. But in the end, they learned the truth. They weren't just dealing with a landowner. They were dealing with the person who kept their entire community alive. And now, finally, they understood the value of working together instead of against each other. He walked home slowly, the sun setting behind him, the land quiet and safe again. The fight was over. Peace had returned, and he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened in the future, he would always protect what was his, not out of anger, but out of love for the place he built with his own hands, and that was something no HOA could ever take away.